好多謝Teresa 同我哋咁精彩嘅分享。我絕對相信我哋 ASL 嘅 marketplace， 無論喺技術上邊或者喺 go to market 上邊，一定係能夠 connect to 大家嘅 business。咁相信大家喺過往呢幾年裏邊都會同意嘅，喺市場上邊，無論係 cloud native 或者 as a service 呢一個題目咧，都係非常之熱門嘅。咁而我相信各位來賓咧，一定都會想聽一下由一個專業嘅分析師點樣去睇呢個 as a service 呢個市場發展嘅趨勢。所以喺嚟緊嘅時間裏邊咧 I would like to invite Mr. Linus Lai, who is the Vice President of IDC Asia Pacific Software and Services Research Group. And Linus is going to share with us the IDC FutureScape prediction and how IT responds to the digital first. So, Linus, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Aaron. I would really like to be in Hong Kong right now, but I'm afraid I can't. I'm based in Sydney, and I'm so glad I could address all of you here in the crowd. Now, I'll just move to the slide so that everyone has a view of what I'm going to present. Essentially, I have taken a couple of predictions that I thought would be very, very useful for the audience today in Hong Kong. So let's move on to the first slide. Now, this is the first time ever in recorded IT history that IT spending didn't go below GDP growth rates. If you think about the Asian financial crisis, you think about the global financial crisis, you think about other crises in the past, IT spending always dropped below GDP growth, right? But this is the first time in history that IT spending didn't drop below GDP growth. And the reason for this is very simple, because IT was sort of like the one who actually came to the rescue, right? Who helped companies operate, in spite of being locked down. We were able to do things in a hybrid work environment. We were able to deliver our products and services online, and do contactless solutions in many, many cases, from government to healthcare to education as well. So think about it. This, I think, is a turning point for IT and CIOs as well. If you move to the next slide, IDC is saying that when we have such a confluence, of digital technologies driving, business continuity in a pandemic, we're now approaching this concept of a digital first world. And in this digital first world, we are going to start to see even economic impact from digital products and services. So whether you're a manufacturer, whether you are in the trading business, whether you're in the insurance business, or even in the healthcare sector, you'll find that there is a digital first element to your products, your services, and your experiences as well, your customer and user experiences as well. Now, in the next slide, this is a very simple illustration, right, of what it means to be digital first, right? And many of you know this drama series, right, Squid Games. And, for an organization who had, if you just imagine and put yourself in this situation where you see 17% growth, right, in your audiences, right, in 10 days, right? This is a very simple example of what it means to be digital first, right? And you can see here, the actress Jun Ho Young is now the #1 Instagrammer in Korea, who has the #1 followers in Korea when it comes to the actors community. So that's really, really fantastic. And I think this can give you an idea of what happens when we pivot to digital. Let's move on to the next one. So when we think about the technologies to build a digital first world, right, there are essentially going to be about 9 of them, right? There's going to be technologies that allow the future of operations, technologies that enable the future of work, technologies that help you build intelligence, that's analytics and AI to deliver business value. You've got technologies that you need to modernize your infrastructure as well, and that's digital infrastructure. You've got the future of connectedness. You've got customers and consumers technologies. you've got digital innovation technologies, and you've got security and trust technologies, as well as industry ecosystem technologies. And as an organization who's now dealing in the digital first world, you need to master each of these 9 areas, right, that we are calling out. So let's move on to the next slide. And when we look at the strategic imperatives for IT, how does IT respond, right? And it can be overwhelming. Moving to the cloud, is just one part of getting things right. But at the end of the day, we are looking at a couple of things here. We're looking at 3 very simple concepts. We're looking at how IT can play a role to help businesses become more agile. And this is obviously moving to DevOps methodologies and changing, how we work in our service delivery organizations. If you think about it from the second pillar there on the green side, IT's job is also to simplify, right? As we rely more on multi-cloud services and unique microservices architectures, things can get really, really complicated. And if we're not too careful, we then need another layer of operations upon operations. So you've got to be very careful to make sure that we standardize as well, land on open technologies, and by driving standardization, we're also going to make operations a lot easier as well. And then lastly, we are dealing with a vast amount of legacy as well. We can't just shut off our systems, our legacy systems, but we do need to modernize them, because it's quite evident now, in order to deliver real-time user experiences, we actually have to modernize some of the legacy, and therefore take advantage of cloud-based delivery systems, look at our new organizational practices as well that need to be modernized, not just the IT, and of course, modernize the application delivery architectures as well. So let's move on to the next one and think about where are we today, right? And this is true for Hong Kong as well. When we look at the new applications that are being built, right, by your peers, we see that many of them are starting to use some of these modern development architectures. So you've got API lifecycle management, you've got organizations who are already in combined DevSecOps teams. And the way to read this chart is, if you see the needle, that's sort of like telling you that we are somewhere at about 30%, right, of organizations using these methodologies for the vast majority of their new applications. When you're building new applications, you're no longer using traditional legacy waterfall methods. You're using cloud-native development. You're using serverless computing and architectures from the cloud providers. You're even using application containerization. Let's move on to the next one. So this is my first prediction today, and I really want to start with security first, because that's the foundational of what we've been hearing from the Hong Kong market as well. And the prediction is very simple. By 2023, most C-suite leaders will implement business critical KPIs tied to data availability, recovery, and stewardship, as rising levels of cyber attacks expose the scale of data at risk, right? We're not talking about systems in general anymore. We're talking about security with data. And if you think about it, automation also plays a very, very large role in this. We've heard about automation in security operations, and that was our prediction in 2020. This year, we have a prediction on automation in third-party risk management. Obviously, during the pandemic, we started to outsource quite a lot of services, and then we were exposed, right, to third-party risk. And in next year, we think that automation has a very, very important role to play in compliance as well. And the next slide just simply gives you an illustration of AI and ML technologies in the security space, from in the past using AI and ML for endpoint protection and signature and whitelisting, to the future, which is now AI-infused threat detection, integrated offerings to look at SIEM and correlate events as well as they happen and put context right into what's been happening in our environment. So now we know exactly what's been happening across applications and infrastructure to then become a lot more smart with our knowledge of some of these threats that are starting to expose. We think that it's going to be impossible for human security operators to cover the vast variety of alerts, and therefore automation has a very, very large role to play in this. Now, the next slide is the prediction I have that says by 2023, nearly 80% of enterprises will utilize as a service private clouds to support meeting critical cloud needs. Now, we all know of infrastructure as a service or platform as a service from the major cloud providers, but we're also starting to see consumption models for building your own private cloud. And this is really largely driven by investment priorities and infrastructure challenges as well. So I'll just read out to you the top investment priorities here is to modernize compute and storage systems to deliver superior performance for modern data-driven applications, right? And that's all about driving a lot more performance-related KPIs as opposed to our traditional reliability and uptime KPIs, because now users will, for example, abandon the shopping cart, right? The shopping cart, right? In 3 seconds, right? If they don't get the experience that they're looking for. And then if you look at the top infrastructure challenges, you'll see number one is building an agile environment, right? Platform using containers for modern workloads. So again, we see the vast majority of organizations out there now don't just want to use virtual machines from Amazon or Azure or Google. They're starting to use containers and serverless functions as well. And their preference is to use some of these technologies because they can span both public and private clouds. Let's move on to the next slide. So IDC's vision of digital infrastructure for a digital-first enterprise is very, very simple. We only have 3 pillars by which to guide us in our digital infrastructure journey. The first one is the ability to deploy anywhere. The second one, to run operations a lot more autonomously. And lastly, to use cloud-centric or cloud-native technology as much as possible. If you subscribe to these 3 principles, I don't think you'll go wrong with your infrastructure investments in the future. Now let's take a look at each one of those. In the next slide, we can see here that the days of single cloud is no longer here. We are now in a period of many years, actually, of growth of a multi-cloud and hybrid cloud environment. And not only are we using multiple clouds, we're starting to do a lot of interoperability between clouds as well. So I know some of you actually have your applications and certain workloads in one cloud, but are calling data from another cloud, for example. And when you think about it, you can see the chart on the left, on the right here. It's actually private clouds that are much more in demand, right? As opposed to just pure public clouds as well. So this idea of having the same technologies that are afforded by public cloud providers is very, very important to organizations. Now let's move on to the next one. When we think about ubiquitous deployment, we think about, yes, we can deliver it anywhere. We want to make sure that what we put in our data center, what we put in the cloud, and what we put at the edge locations have the same architectures. We could also get a private cloud from a public cloud provider or vice versa. Not only that, we also want to make sure we have the flexibility in the way that we consume those services. So just now it was talked about as a service, and that's obviously moving to not just an OpEx perspective, but a consumption basis as well. So you really only pay for what you provision, right? And of course, there's also a lot of deliberation on whether you want to share that infrastructure as well. So that's the decisions that we need to make in this space. Let's move on to the next slide. And in this space, how many of you think that in your centralized data center, you've got maybe majority of your data, right? You actually think that majority of your data sits in your central data center. This survey actually bust that myth, right? And this survey tells us that, at least we've got at most maybe about 30% or so data sitting in a central location, with the rest of it spread over other data center locations or in the public cloud. point in the age as well. This is actually quite a telling story of how during the pandemic, we've moved tremendous amounts of workloads, applications, and data into the cloud. Next, please. So one of the things that I also want to touch on today is the fact that as we start to look at these modern architectures, we also need to look at how we are changing the way we work and what's IT's role again to support the way that we're going to change the way we work, right? So our prediction here is by 2023, digital transformation and business volatility will drive 55% of Asia 2,000 organizations to deploy remote or hybrid first work models, redefining the work processes and engaging diverse talent pools. Next slide, please. So when we think about the future of work, right, we need to understand that there are 4 essential areas, right? You need to think about the workspace. You need to think about the workforce, which is the talent side on the right. You need to take a look at the worker experience as well, trust, right? The ability to drive trust with everything that they do, because obviously everyone is spread over a large location now. And of course, you need to be able to deliver, right, the right culture for this to happen as well. So those are more of the softer issues, right, when we're thinking about the future of work. Let's move on to the next slide. So there are a couple of things that we need to deliver in order for this to happen. We need to be able to deliver remote and hybrid work models. We need to deliver intelligent digital workspaces. We need to shift to cloud managed services as much as possible, whether it's connectivity for SD-WAN, endpoint management, or even services. There needs to be automation as much as possible as well, because we don't want to be the roadblock, right, for certain things to happen, right? So let's move on to the next one. When we think about this sort of like triangle of culture, space, and workforce, there are so many things to be wary of. We need to make sure that as an IT organization, we need to tick off all of these 10 items. I wouldn't go through all of them. You can see them here and you get a copy of it as well. But generally, it's no longer the provisioning of hardware or software, but making sure that we can actually automate and augment work activities or minimize context switching intelligently, without users having to decide, okay, this is what I need to do when I'm working here or there. We need secure connectivity. We need a lot of things here, and it's all listed out here. So it's just not your traditional way of provisioning endpoints, devices, and software that's at stake here. Let's move on to the next slide. So what are the biggest challenges you've set for hybrid work to happen? IT support, and that's one of the biggest challenges. Secure and remote access, visibility into IT assets as well. I've had many stories of organizations who, from an asset management perspective, would even fail the test, right? To understand, what's out there to be able to patch and make sure that they have less of a risk and more increased compliance as well. So these are some of the great challenges that you face. Let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to sort of land this presentation to what was said earlier as well. By 2025, 60% of enterprises will fund their line of business and IT projects through OpEx budgets, matching how vendors provide their services with a focus on outcomes that are determined by SLAs and KPIs. So as we move to this as a service model, it's no longer just talking about a move to, hey, I'm going to do CapEx, OpEx, or it's a leasing model. A lot of people get it wrong, that they think that it's just a leasing model. But this chart really gives you an idea of the differences between the 3 services sourcing models that you could choose. A lot of us know what it is to outsource, right? For example, from a device perspective or from a data center perspective. A lot of us know what it means to buy discrete services as well. For example, a next business day contract for a fleet of 20,000 devices. And this is very common. But then we're starting to move to this consumption and as a service model as well. This is a scalable plan. It's obviously not just a leasing plan, because it offers services attached to the device as well. And it's a lot more aligned to business outcomes and helps in building the culture for driving this transformation as well. Now let's move on to the next slide. When we think about the evolution of services as well, we always think of, it's our job to have the services that are very closely tied to the box, right? And that's at the top, the asset-based support. But as we start to move down that journey, right, of a as a service and consumption model, we want to make sure that we get all of those as well, on the way down. We want to make sure that we start to be a little bit more proactive. We know we can get a lot more data and insight into the environment and understanding, some of the compliance lapses that do happen. And of course, we do want to do some benchmarking. We want to do some TCO and ROIs as well into, what we're using and how we're using those as well. And we finally go into the business process support itself. So when you look at your services related to subscription models or consumption models, you need to also tie them to your activities on, what I would call traditionally managed services, right? Because if you think about managed services, it's not just support, it's monitoring, troubleshooting, governance, compliance, provisioning, backup, performance optimization, and security as well. All of these take your time and they take your money as well, right, in order to achieve. And that's why consumption models are becoming a lot more popular now, as they tend to embed all of these as well. Let's move on to the next one. So very often I'm asked, how do you tell a good provider, right? Because if everybody offers as a service, then, how do we tell the difference? Because everything looks like plain vanilla, right? But actually it's not. You've got actually 4 criteria to measure them by. The first one is on the portfolio. So obviously you can look at, what they offer and what levels they offer. In some cases, there'll be many flavors, right, that they offer as well in some of these portfolio, and some of them are bundled as well. Secondly, we will also want to take a look at how they integrate, the way that they behave as an organization as well. Their front office, their ticketing, their help desk, their back office systems connected. Are they delivering, these services through a triage of teams as opposed to levels, like tiers of support levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. I don't think that's very nice to experience. And, they actually empower their frontliners to do more than just take calls and, raise tickets. You can also look at it from a service quality perspective. We encourage end users out there to adopt a customer service quality lens, right? By looking at how your service provider behaves. Do what they do instill confidence, in their behavior? Do you feel safe with your transactions with them? Are they reliable in their services, and are they responsive in their services as well, right? To be able to integrate some of these tools for themselves as well. And lastly, the intelligence. We're now at a stage where a lot of our infrastructure and devices are doing a lot of telemetry and data for observation. It's very, very important for a service provider to not just say, yeah, we've got the data and we've got the logs, but to make sense of it as well, to be able to say, hey, you know what, I've taken a look at your logs, I've taken a look at the data from the CMDB in ServiceNow, for example, and looking at some of your endpoint protection, I realize, that there's actually a mismatch, right? And there's a gaps as well. So be able to use data to your advantage as well. Now let's move on to the next one. And therefore, that leads me to how you engage with them as well, right? It used to be we valued our engagement because there was a single point of contact and it was just direct access. But now we are actually moving to a situation where we want more from our technical account managers. We want them to be able to do preventative advisory. We want someone who knows the environment very well and can actually provide recommendations for optimization and even things that are perhaps out of scope, right? Strictly speaking. Let's move on to the next one. So in conclusion, I want to say that as we move to a as a service model, right? It's not a CAPEX to OPEX discussion, right? Our research tells us there are 6 very distinct reasons to move to an as-a-service model. The first one is, of course, accelerating value, right? You're now being able to package all those integration and transitioning services to accelerate the value. You want a provider who can deliver end-to-end capabilities, right? And not just discrete capabilities. You want a service provider who can also drive standardization. As I said before, without standardization, you will just not be able to do, for example, cross-cloud control, or policy, or even automation in order to drive, better operations. Fourthly, we're also moving to as-a-service models because they afford us a path to modernization. So in some cases, they also support, our agile and DevOps maturity as well. Fifthly, we're also looking at the entire services lifecycle. So we're not just saying, hey, we're only doing so because we want the support, but it's from the consulting, the integration, the managed services and the support. And lastly, but not least, you've told us time and time again, you're looking for service providers and platform providers who can help you to drive innovation within your own enterprise as well. These are the 6 very important reasons. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and listening to me and wish you all the best for the rest of the event.